Sincerely, thank you all for coming today, because this is the easiest part of my day. So I thank you for listening to what you're going to hear, because the rest of my day is filled with the pressure of facts and making sure that I never say or do anything that isn't absolutely accurate. I mean, one little mistake can cost somebody millions of dollars. Now, I don't want to mislead you. It doesn't mean that I'm just going to stand up here and make things up. But one of the reasons music is so fascinating to me is because it's so subjective. Let me give you an absolute truth. There is no right or wrong based on what you like, because whatever you like is what you like. And everything in music emanates from that. The rest of it's very subjective. For example, what was the birth of rock and roll? Anybody here think they were around for the birth of rock and roll? Well, you might have been. It's really subjective. The best definition I've ever heard about the birth, the roots of rock and roll came from Howling Wolf, who said, well, the blues had a baby and they named it rock and roll. And that's apt. But there are so many other types of music that go into rock and roll, from swing, jazz, country, African rhythms. It's a conglomerate of everything. So from here on in, don't check my facts. Everything I say is subjective. It's easy to find Jews in rock because they're absolutely everywhere. Now, we're going to explore what some people think was the absolute birth of rock. And there was a Jew in the room, and I'll explain that in a second. But like I said, it could be anything. So I'll give you an example. Anybody think the Beach Boys have anything to do with Jews in rock? Well, here's some of the proof.
New cloth, yarmulke embroidered in gold. It sure is bold. I wear it everywhere when I go round to other AZAs. They don't know what to say. So be true to your show.
Good thing I prefaced this with there are no facts. That was fake. But everything you're about to hear now is absolutely true, including what I referenced was the birth of rock. Listen to this. It's a country song. Let me tell you, it sounds a lot like this, doesn't it?
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true?
It does for a real interesting reason. Chuck Berry came up to Chicago. And Chuck Berry, who was from Missouri, loved country music. And he was playing that first song you heard, Ida Red, at Chess Records. And somebody said, why don't you put some blues along with that sound? And that, a lot of people think, was part of the birth of rock. Again, it's very subjective, but it was Leonard Chess, who owned Chess Records, who gave Chuck Berry that suggestion. Now, in the early days of rock and roll, there were a lot of people behind the scenes, and I want to share a theory with you. Let's talk about infancy. Cute little baby in diapers. Think about the birth of rock and roll as a child, an infant, or what I've actually heard referred to as, and I might be spelling this wrong, pictures. Rock and roll in its infancy, things like this. Phil Spector produced the Ronettes. Here's somebody you may or may not recognize.
Hello, everybody. Hi, all tonight. This is Alan Freed, the old king of the Moondoggers, and it's time again for another of your favorite rock and roll sessions that you enjoy.
Alan Freed was one of the first disc jockeys to ever play black music on mainstream radio. Alan Freed was Jewish. Phil Spector was Jewish. Here's a guy that wasn't Jewish in Memphis who said, brilliant idea, if I could find a white guy that I could market that sounded black, that had soul, I bet I could make an absolute fortune. And he found that guy. You know who it is? Elvis, obviously not Jewish. Who wrote this song? Stoller and Lieber wrote the song Jailhouse Rock and wrote a lot of other songs as well that were big hits in the 50s. And by the way, somebody that had one of the hugest albums of the 70s, who is Jewish, actually was responsible for writing some of the biggest songs of the 50s. Carole King and Jerry Goffin. Now let me give you another example from what some people say is the infancy of rock and roll. That's Herb Alpert. In case you didn't know, Herb Alpert is the A in A&M Records. Here's some really deep trivia a lot of people don't know. Aside from owning A&M Records, aside from having lots and lots of big hits, aside from writing some songs that were huge hits back in this infancy of rock and roll, including a song called Wonderful World, which he co-wrote. Do you know that Herb Alpert's in the movie 10 Commandments? He really is. He has a very, very big role in that movie. He should have been playing the trumpet instead of the incessant chauffeur that went on over and over, but he actually has a big hand in rock and roll as being the president of A&M Records. Now, here's a theory that I want to share with you, aside from just throwing at you all these different people that happen to be Jewish, that also happen to be around not only at the birth of rock and roll, but throughout the growth of rock and roll. Interesting thing about infants, usually, and we all know every exception, usually they're pretty innocent. When you're in your infancy, sure you get into some trouble, but you're rather innocent. Think about rock and roll in its earliest days. Bill Haley and the Comets. I mean, even though that type of music scared parents to death, we look back on it now and think, yakety yak? That's pretty innocent, right? That's rock and roll in its infancy. Now we're going to take you to rock and roll as a teenager. Or which, for the sake of today, I guess we'll just call bar mitzvah boys. Or bat mitzvah. We're taking this infant now into the 60s. Let me play something kind of interesting for you.
Three cool cats. Three cool cats.
Anybody know who this is? You do.
Splitting up a dip, candy bar, talking all about how sharp they are.
That was the audition tape for the Beatles. Turned down by Decca Records. We're still in a pretty innocent phase, right? Now I'm going to play something for you that might upset you. If you listen to the intent, it's a little different than some of the shocking words. This is Paul McCartney.
Epi, he was my dad originally. There's a book bit come out on me, and I only looked and just flicked through it. And there's one quote where he says, don't get in with Jew boys or something. It's exactly the opposite of what my dad said. He said, get a good Jewish manager, they're very good with business. It's real Liverpool attitude, real working class attitude, and he said that. So we did eventually, and Brian came down to Cavan and all that story. I think people know that bit.
Paul McCartney talking about Brian Epstein, who deserves infinite amounts of credit for making the Beatles what they are. In my own subjective, once again, opinion, greatest rock and roll band ever. I was lucky enough, my mom was from London, by the way, and so growing up as a kid to have a mom from London, I was instantly cool. And Meet the Beatles came out just as I was getting interested in music, and every subsequent album, as they grew musically and socially, became the soundtrack for my adolescence. But we're still, and trust me, I got in enough trouble, but I'm still pretty innocent as a teenager. Right alongside the Beatles were the antithesis of innocent, and that would be, exactly, Rolling Stones.
I'm not talking about the kind of clothes she wears.
You know, the Rolling Stones were managed by Alan Klein, very astute Jewish businessman. By the way, talking about, we were talking about the Beatles a moment ago, Paul McCartney's father-in-law was Jewish, Lee Eastman. Linda McCartney was Jewish. But so far we focused on a lot of behind the scenes. As an aside, Alan Klein was the later manager of the Rolling Stones. Mick Jagger was a very astute kid. He went to the London School of Economics. Their first manager was also Jewish, who really helped them navigate a lot of early business issues. Later wrote a book, a tell-all book about the Beatles, and to his credit, Mick Jagger said, I don't really expect our attorney, accountant, and advisor to be writing books about us, management. Now, we're into the teens. I'm going to give you a little bit of a dichotomy. We're in, as I said, some innocent years, but we're going to include this time.
Look at that stupid. Because something is happening here, but you don't know what it is. Do you, Mr. Jones?
One of the most powerful writers of our time. By the way, his son,
So long ago I don't remember when. That's when they said
Jacob Dylan, whose band is the Wallflowers. Anybody ever heard of Peter Himmelman? Peter Himmelman is a guy you should check out. Bob Dylan's son-in-law.
Talked a bit about traveling, told him that I'd been to the USSR.
He's had some pretty powerful music. Now we're talking about Bob Dylan in this innocent teenage era. Remember rock and roll, infancy in the 50s? Now as a teenager, speaking of Dylan, here are some other guys.
Call you up, invest your time.
Covered Bob Dylan on a lot of their hits. Marc Bolan, Howard Kaylan, Turtles. Let me give you a lot of other somewhat innocent examples. Sal Yanofsky,
Somewhere in the city, back of my neck getting dirt and gray.
Muppet Spoonful,
Been down, isn't it a pity? Doesn't seem to be a shadow in the city.
Everybody knows that the day's so
Leonard Cohen,
everybody rolls with their fingers crossed.
Mama Cass,
Monday, Monday, so good to me.
there's an obvious one,
A winter's day,
Paul Simon, one of the greatest songwriters of our lifetime.
dark December.
And of course, Art Garfunkel.
I am alone.
We're still, despite some of the social unrest going on, we're still in the teenage years of rock and roll. Here's something I bet you've never heard before from a guy you've heard many, many times. Jewish guy that who's written a few songs by the name of Neil Diamond. Now, remember, this seems like a little bit of a dichotomy, but also remember, there's no right or wrong. We're still in very innocent years, despite the fact that here's a song Neil Diamond had that most people have never heard.
La la, hot, hot, give me some hot. Get what you want.
Say what you think.
High, high, I wanna get high. And never give it up if you give it a try.
That's Neil Diamond. Here's another one from that era.
There she was, just walking down the street singing.
Manfred Mann. So, we've given you a lot of examples of Jewish artists and Jewish artists that happen to be simultaneous to rock and roll in its teens. Now let's go out of the teens. And what happens to our guy when he's in his 20s? By the way, still not wearing a suit. This is now somebody in their 20s, and I'm going to continue the correlation and ask you to think about what happens when a teenager you know gets into their 20s. Are they mature? Are they experienced in life? Are they somebody you would trust implicitly? They're still half teenager, half grown up. I guess for that we'll just call it boy. Let's continue on this growth of rock and roll. Let's take it now into, if you extrapolate it to a person, into its 20s. We talked about Bob Dylan earlier. Right around this period, Bob Dylan himself started to change, alongside a guy by the name of Mike Bloomfield and Paul Butterfield at the Newport Folk Festival. Remember, a lot of what you heard here was blues-based, but there was a lot of folk music in that. The Lovin' Spoonful, the Turtles. There was, again, an innocence to it. Still talking about relevant items, but what Bob Dylan did at Newport Folk Festival, and here's Paul Butterfield, was allegedly to get booed. Here's this icon getting booed. Why? Because his backing band, which also at times included another Jewish guy by the name of Robbie Robertson of the band, Bob Dylan took his music.
I've been Bob since 1959, 1960. So we were all friends and everything. And the funny thing is that he wasn't booed off stage. That was the ridiculous part of it. There was maybe 2 rows of people in this entire concert, which was packed, that were booing because they didn't want to hear him do electric music. They wanted to hear him do nothing but folk music.
That started, and talk about that attitude of 20s, where you're a little dangerous. That started to worry people. Now rock and roll is in its 20s, and it's starting to concern some people. One of the coolest things that ever happened to me was I was in Los Angeles having breakfast, and in case you haven't noticed yet, I'm not that shy, so I'm not going to have a problem talking to anybody around me. I look over and there's Carlos Santana sitting next to me, and that was all that came out. Ever heard this?
Got a black magic woman. Got a black magic woman.
That's not Santana. That's Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac was started by Peter Green. Mick Fleetwood and John McVeigh were in his backing band. Then he let them just name it after themselves. Peter Green was a Jewish guy who was a little dangerous. Let me give you some other examples. You might never have heard this before. This is another demo tape. This band got signed right away.
Let's swim to the moon. Let's climb through the
Fieger of the Doors, Jewish guy. Dangerous, right? This isn't when you're talking about the Doors, you're no longer talking about the innocent music of infants and teenagers. Let me give you a few more examples.
What goes up must come down. Spinning wheel, got to go round.
Steve Katz, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Al Kooper, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. What they did was to say, let's take, just like all the things we've seen Born before, let's put horns on rock and roll. Do you realize that was a dangerous and unheard of thing back then? We're in the danger years of rock and roll. Speaking of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Laura Nero. Sounds pretty innocent, along with Janice Ian. She was writing songs that hit you in the face, part of the dangerous era of rock and roll.
I was sitting home on the West End watching KTV with a TV friend. I'm watching the news and the world's in a mess. Going the hungry and the world distressed. Heard this is the bill, it's full throttle and a drink your son's boy, put it in a waffle and white hat. You check what's in the pan, make sure the candy's in. There's no rabbit.
That could probably be released today. That's Lou Reed, who passed away about 1.5 years ago. Again, coming out of that dangerous era of rock and roll.
You're so sweet, you're so fine.
Marc Bolan,
I want you for everything.
T-Rex, she's bad. Jewish guy that did something very, very dangerous in these 20s of rock and roll. Hugely popular all over the world. He said, I don't need the United States. He was British. It was a pretty dangerous thing. It kept him off the radio here in the US for a lot of years. Marc Bolan, another Jewish guy. Here's another guy, dangerous not by his sound, but again by his words.
In America, you get food to eat. Won't have to run through the jungle and scuff up your feet.
That's Randy Newman. So, now, by the way, before we jump out of the 20s, we just heard a song about America. Around the same time that rock and roll was going from dangerous to the next stage, not only in America, but there was something going on in England. Remember, back here, they were the Beatles, the Stones, and all the British invasion bands. What they were doing was taking American blues music, regenerating it into something and selling it back to us. They started missing out on some of the dangerousness of rock and roll in the 20s. They didn't invent it. America did. So in England, there was a guy by the name of Malcolm McLaren, Jewish guy, who again was on the business side. It's kind of interesting how the rebirth occurred. We saw a lot of behind the scenes work going on here. Behind the scenes, that guy was doing this in England. Anybody know what this is? I can't subject you to a lot of that. It's the Sex Pistols. So Malcolm McLaren was the guy behind the Sex Pistols. Mick Jones, by the way, a band that came on the heels of the Sex Pistols in The Clash. Also part of that attempt to regenerate, witnessing what was going on to this infant, this teenager, and this person in their 20s. Now, let's move rock and roll into its 30s. And this is where we'll take this same character, maybe give him some glasses, and a suit and tie finally. Think about yourself. You've gone from being an infant to a teenager to kind of rebellious. Now when we're in the 30s, we're expecting a lot of doctors and lawyers, right? Guess what happened to rock and roll when it hit its 30s? Now I'm not saying it's bad. Let me take you into rock and roll now in its 30s. Bruce Springsteen, whose drummer, by the way, Max Weinberg, one of the greatest drummers around. Why would I bring up this band as we talk about rock and roll in its 30s?
One of these nights, one of these crazy long nights.
The Eagles exemplified corporate rock. The Eagles' greatest hits, one of the most highest selling albums of all time to date. Irving Azoff, by the way, their manager. Same guy that managed Joe Walsh, who ended up in the Eagles. Same guy that managed REO Speedwagon. Here's another great example, very, very Jewish example, as we head into rock and roll in its 30s.
Slow down, you crazy child. You're so ambitious for a
Billy
juvenile,
Joel.
but then if you're so smart, tell me why are you still so...
By the way, anybody surprised that he's Jewish? Billy Joel was a boxer as a kid. He was in a street gang. And there were a lot of people that didn't really think he was Jewish. Here's Paul
Well, there was the
Reiser.
New York thing, and then there was the ethnic pride that we had. Although I must say it was a little blurry, the ethnic thing. Jews thought he was Jewish, Italian guys thought he was Italian. It was up for grabs. It didn't become clear until after a while when we started seeing just the caliber of staggeringly beautiful women that Billy was dating that Jews decided he must be Italian. So that's...
Want another example of a couple of guys that met in college? Donald and Walter, Jewish guys that did this 30s rock. Steely Dan. Here's another one. Brilliant writer, Warren Zevon. But don't think, he wasn't giving up his creative aspect, but he was selling records. That's what this era was about. Jay Giles Band, a couple of Jewish guys. In fact, around this time there's just an explosion of great music. Chris Stein's band. Blondie. The Knack. Doug Fieger. A couple of ancillary interesting aspects. My Sharona. There is a Sharona. In fact, she's a residential real estate agent in Los Angeles who has her website. Just look up My Sharona sometime. And Doug Fieger's brother, anybody know about him? He was the attorney in the Kevorkian case and got lots of national publicity. His brother was the guy that started the Knack. And again, talk about this theory that I'm trying to share with you, which is rock and roll has now grown from innocent to fun and innocent to a little dangerous, and then now into rock and roll's in its 30s at this point. This is about selling records, but still sincerely having a message. And that's what a lot of these artists and there were so many Jewish artists that came out of that era gave us.
The Monday warrior, mean strike. Today's Tom Sawyer, mean pride.
Rush. Geddy Lee, lead singer of Rush. By the way, his real first name is not Geddy. It's Gary. He had a Jewish grandmother that couldn't say Gary, and she just called him Geddy, and the name stuck. Yet another band from that era where records were selling left and right. Records were coming out at an amazing rate. 10 albums a week. Record companies are doing great. Eric Blue Oyster Cult. Great music. And a lot of business going on. So now, I gotta take us into another era. You know, in order to do this, I'm gonna have to go backwards. I did it here. There's a lot of hair here. There's expensively puffed hair here. As you guessed it, 40s, 50s, maybe there. Rock and roll is going into its 40s, its 50s as we move ahead. It has been startlingly creative to date, right? All these songs I've played are in our memories. They're great songs, and they did two things. They had a message, they made you feel good, they said something, and they sold a lot of records. Now we're starting to get into kind of a squirrely area.
I'm just a gigolo, and everywhere I go, people know the part I play.
David Lee Roth.
Pay for every dance, selling each romance.
It sounds okay, but I remember, and boy, talk about history repeating itself, Louie Prima originally did that song. Sam Butera was his sax player, and Sam Butera told me one time, I never saw a penny from David Lee Roth. Something is wrong here. Well, no, it's not David Lee Roth's responsibility, but something is a little wrong. We're going backwards. We've gone from growth, danger, interesting, unbelievable music. What's going on here? Rock and roll is now, today, in its 60s and 70s in some way. So, let me give you a few examples of some other Jewish guys still making great music.
Down at the New Amsterdam, down at this yellow-haired
Adam
girl,
from the Counting Crows.
conversation. She said it's cold outside. She's
Adam Daner from Matchbox 20.
She's always worried about.
There's a pattern here that I can't explain. Here's another Adam. 3 Adams in a row. That's a coincidence, but there is something else going on here.
Backstreet friend, they get loud.
Backstreet Boy and Punchline. Beastie Boys. Rock and roll, now in its 40s and 50s, I guess, if I need a term for today, rock and roll is now a bench. I mean, there's nothing truly unique, nothing worryingly dangerous about it. Rock and roll has now grown up. And so, throughout this entire course that we've just been on, with contributions at the absolute highest level from some 40 different Jewish people we've mentioned already in the course of this, and hundreds we've left out, rock and roll is now here. So, what does that leave? Well, I think it leaves a couple things that we need to do. One is we need to remember that all of this, the mensches, the doctors, the lawyers, the dangerous adolescents, the teenagers, the youngsters, they all took from what came before them. And that's something we shouldn't forget, because whatever happens next might very well be like this. This was recorded in a basement in Milwaukee.
Life on the moon. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every now and then I think about someone looking down.
Little Milwaukee with a tape recorder, who's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's the late Howie Epstein. Recorded here in Milwaukee. Here's my point. We've watched this amazing history. We've watched this little infant grow now into something you could call elderly if you want. But it's not ending. And it was built with great contributions from the past, a lot of Jews through its present, and a lot of people that will be around for the future. The only thing that I can tell you, and remember I said there are no facts, so since there are no facts, it's all subjective, I am very comfortable telling you I have no idea what's next. No idea. A lot of people when I share this theory say, okay, well then what's next? How do I know? How did anybody know this or that? But the one thought I'll leave you with also comes from a Jewish rocker who really sums it up very well into one word. I don't know, but I tell you what, if you witnessed all of this and enjoyed it, I look forward to the future with great anticipation. Here's the word. That's Carly Simon. So whether your background, like Carly Simon's, was the child of the founder of Simon & Schuster, one of the biggest publishing firms in the world, or you're Howie Epstein in the basement of your parents' house in Milwaukee, the people that participated from start to finish in this are as diverse a group as you could ever find, which is why I come right back to my initial statement, why rock and roll? So I hope you enjoyed this, I hope you learned something, and I hope you don't mind my pontificating the last 45 minutes. Thanks.